So good evening. I'm so happy we could all get together in one place here. So my name is Melinda Verdanier, and I am the grants coordinator at the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I'd like to welcome you here to our annual Festival of Books. And we're really pleased that you've joined us for this event. And like I said, that we could all come together here in this one space. We would like to acknowledge first and foremost that this program comes to you from ground, which is the homeland of the Ocetishekawan, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. The South Dakota Humanities Council honors and appreciates the Indigenous people who have the longest relationship to this place. Before our event gets underway, I'd like to share some housekeeping details. We ask that you keep your microphone muted throughout our event to minimize background noise. If you'd like to ask questions or share comments with the presenters, please type them in the chat section on Zoom, which you can open by clicking on the conversation bubble at the bottom of your screen or in the comments section on Facebook, and we'll pass along as many as possible at the end of our session. We encourage you to buy books by our presenting authors at your local independent bookstore. Our official festival booksellers are Books A Million and the Birdcage Bookstore and Mercantile, both in Rapid City. You can buy directly from the authors and publishers, and I'll be posting some links in the chat. To help us continue to improve our festival, we'd appreciate your filling out an evaluation form. We'll share a link in the chat section on Zoom, and we'll also email you a link to the survey at the conclusion of the festival. Finally, you can help keep our festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. Just visit our website, sdhumanities.org, and click on the donate button. Festival wouldn't be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who've already donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of our festival guide and also on our website. And now on with our show. The program is called Bringing the 1888 Children's Blizzard to Life and features two presenters. We have Melanie Benjamin is the author of the New York Times and USA Today best-selling historical novels, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, The Aviator's Wife, and The Mistress of the Ritz. Her latest, The Children's Blizzard, is the 2021 one-book South Dakota, offering a deeply researched and fictionalized take on the deadly storm that swept through Dakota Territory in January 1888. An Indiana native, Benjamin lives on the East Coast and puts her theatrical training to use at literary events. Lauren Tarshis writes children's books, including the New York Times bestselling I Survived series, which retells historical disasters from the perspective of a boy or girl who lived to tell the tale. She's also the author of Emma Jean Lazarus Fell Out of a Tree, a Golden Kite Honor Book, and Oprah Book Club Pick. As Senior Vice President, Editor-in-Chief, and Publisher, Classroom Magazine Division at Scholastic Incorporated, Tarshis oversees 21 classroom magazines, reaching 1 in 3 American students. First, we'll hear from Melanie and Lauren, then I'll ask any questions that you put in the chat, and we'll continue the discussion from there. So now, without any further delay, I turn the program over to Melanie and Lauren.
Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Hi, Melanie.
Thank you, Melinda. Hi, Lauren. I know you called me like an hour ago and said, how are we going to start this? And I forgot already.
Oh, dear. Well, what I said was I was a huge fan, and I was so thrilled to be with you. And that what a joy to be able, as writers of historical fiction who delve into these events, there's this incredible thrill of being able to connect with someone and talk to someone, probably one of the few, there's a handful of people who have lived and breathed this event as authors. So I think we decided that you would tell us about your book.
It is. You're right. That is such an interesting point here. I have never, ever, and some of it deliberately, but never talked to another author who wrote about the same subject. Never. And so that it is. And we're writing for different audiences, but we're both writing fiction. And so that is extra special as well, because our, what we do is different than those who write nonfiction. So it'll be really interesting to hear. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my adult novel, The Children's Blizzard, and then you can tell me, then you can do the same, and then we can just chat about why we decided to write about this one blizzard. again, I want to thank so much the South Dakota Humanities Council for all this and for choosing the Children's Blizzard as the one book South Dakota Read this year. That's been very, very special for me. And I've heard from so many South Dakotans, readers over the last few months who have relatives, who know people, you know, in their family tree who were victims or who experienced this blizzard. So for you all, this is your this is like your family scrapbook here that we're writing about. So that makes this very extra special. I wrote The Children's Blizzard. It's my 7th historical novel. And it's my first one that's not completely like biographical historical fiction, where I'm not writing about a real person who lived. In this book, and it was a deliberate decision to kind of go in this direction, I am writing about a real event that happened, but inventing characters around it. So my novel is obviously about the children's blizzard that struck on January 12th, 1888, a day that had dawned kind of surprisingly warm and balmy after a real long period of frigid and cold and bad weather. And so on the Great Plains of this country, in South Dakota, the Dakota Territory, in Nebraska, in Minnesota, in Iowa, homesteaders left their cabins, left their dugouts for the first time in a really, in a couple weeks at least, to go run errands, to let the livestock feed, and most importantly, for the children to go back to school, because they had not been able to do that for several days due to the bitter cold. And around the time that these schools were letting out, this horrific blizzard bore down from the northwest without any warning, and in a heartbeat, school teachers, who were little more than children themselves, had to make life and death decisions. Should they let the children try to outrun the storm, or should they keep them there and try to shelter in place, not knowing how long the blizzard would last, knowing that the schoolhouses were not dwellings that were insulated. They were not meant to shelter human beings in the worst of elements. They would probably run out of fuel. They might run out of food. So these young women had to make these life and death decisions. So that is the heart of the novel. The novel tells the story of 2 sisters, both school teachers, who make the very different decisions when the storm hits, and how these decisions impact their lives and the lives of the school children in their care, for the rest of their days. I also did as I was researching the novel, and I knew a little bit about it before I started writing, but as I was researching it, I did realize also at its heart, it is an immigrant story. And that seemed to be very timely for the time period I was writing it. It is a story of the elements, which, unlike, I think, Lauren, I had never really written a survival story before in any of my books. So that really appealed to me to write the personal relationships, the stories of all these individuals and how they kind of come together in this storm against this bigger backdrop of Mother Nature, nature in its fury. And as a writer, that also challenged me, because, to be honest, weather has never been part of any of my books before. So that kind of made me, come up, how many ways can I describe snow, right? That was a writing challenge I really, really embraced. But along the way, I learned that, the story that we have learned about Manifest Destiny and the homesteading years, through books like the Little House on the Prairie series, that is one version of those years that is not the complete version of those years, and leaves out a lot of people's stories, people of color, the people whose land it first was. It also leaves out kind of the kernel of why these immigrants came to this land to take advantage of the Homestead Act and to settle this territory and to stay. And it was the result of a disinformation campaign put together by those whose best interests would be served by having bodies on the Great Plains. And so they were kind of lured here on a false promise. And in those years that we're talking about in this time period, a really interesting thing I learned that I did not learn in school was that more immigrant homesteaders went home than stayed in this time period, because the land was so punishing and they were so not prepared for it. So all these elements come into play in the Children's Blizzard, and at the heart of it, it is a story of people maybe not acting in the best of ways in a disaster, in a challenging time, which maybe we can relate to today. But it is also, but mostly it is a novel about people coming together and trying to survive and trying to help each other through in the worst that nature has to offer.
Well, there are a lot of shared themes, Melanie, I think between your book for, for our demographic, for adults, and my children's Blizzard book. My series, I Survived, is right now I have 21 books in this series.
Wow.
Each one I've been working on it for 10 years. And what began as a little project to try to create some suspenseful knowledge building books that would help really reluctant and struggling readers engage has grown into, I never dreamt that it would, it would continue today. And it's really morphed into many things. It's my way of enabling all kinds of young people to access important stories that have shaped our world and shaped the ideas that we live by. And it's also been, it enables me to take often extremely, these very complicated events that are often, as you say, simplified for children, and to give teachers a way of sharing them with their nuance, but also in ways that showcase our shared values as Americans in our diverse country. Tolerance, resilience, the ability to change and adapt and pivot. So it's really been this incredible experience for me. And my way into the book was real in the children's Blizzard. I have always been, as I grew up on the East Coast, like many East Coasters, I have always been fascinated by the Great Plains and by the Dakotas and by the incredible history of the land. And I particularly was always captivated by the memoirs of women, of the women who were a part of, who went along with their husbands, like Laura Ingalls Ma. And just as you point out, the reality of the life on the prairie was in many cases so very brutal. And what people encountered, whether it was the children's blizzard or the locust plagues, or just the loneliness of coming from a city or coming from a village in Norway, and where you were surrounded by family and supported by other women and your community, and suddenly being in the middle of a land that is so, where your nearest neighbor is miles away. So my goal in writing this was really to help my readers appreciate the history of the land, to showcase really the true experience of a lot of the people who ended up in this area. And just like you, to really show how people can come together in the face of these really unimaginable and shocking events. And the other thing that I think the kids that I'm writing for are just they're mystified and captivated by is this notion of how vulnerable people were to the elements back then. I always say, like, they didn't have one of these to check the weather to see, if their baseball game was going to be rained out 3 days from now. They didn't have satellites, orbiting the earth, photographing hurricanes forming off the coast of Africa and plotting their course so that people could prepare for something that might happen a week later. So the idea that you were just truly living in this, absolutely vulnerable state, and then how our ideas about weather have evolved. That's also a big part of this book. And I think what is really what so many kids are fascinated by.
Yeah, I had an idea at the very beginning when I started writing this, and my editor at the time really kind of wanted me to bookend it with something in modern times. Like people, I was going to have people in Chicago, which is where I lived at the time, experiencing a blizzard, which happens quite a lot still in Chicago, only now, right? But where you have the cell phone alerts and where you know it's coming, and so you can prepare. And I started it that way, but then I realized that no, that I didn't need that. Like, let's just get into the story. Let's just get into the past right away. But I do think that is, I think, everyone has a memory of a blizzard if they live in a certain part of the country, right? I've heard people tell me that, like, I remember the blizzard of, what was it, 78 was a big one where I grew up in Indianapolis. I think Chicago had a blizzard of 79 that they still talk about. And I think that is really interesting that this particular kind of weather pattern may be different than a tornado, maybe different than, floods, that a blizzard kind of has like people have nostalgic memories of those times of school being let out, snow day, right? Staying home and watching cartoons. And that this novel shows that if you lived on the prairie in 1888, you know, it was just as devastating as an earthquake or you know, a tornado is today.
It's true. And I think one of the things that I was really struck by is that actually the deadliest blizzard in American history happened the very same year as the children's blizzard, but it was not the children's blizzard. It was the blizzard that hit the East Coast that shut down New York City, really changed New York City, caused people to want to decide to build the subway system. But yet that blizzard does not have its grip on the people of the East Coast the way the children's blizzard has its grip on the people of Dakota, Nebraska. You know, I think that you and I both delved so deeply in our research process. And what I did a big trip across Minnesota and South Dakota and stopping in a lot of the little towns and the historical societies and speaking to people from these towns. And, you know, so many of the older people that I met had stories that had been passed down to them by their relatives that were seminal stories from their family history. And so that was very striking too, you know, that this blizzard, you know, had a far greater impact on this region than in the hearts of the people who were there. Then,
Yes,
do you agree with
blizzard,
that?
yeah, and I think the other blizzard got all the publicity, which is so funny.
Yeah.
You know, the other blizzard, there's an American Experience documentary called The Great Blizzard of 1888. And if you just Google Blizzard of 1888,
that's right.
Other East Coast
That's
blizzard
right.
is the one you're going to find. And to me, that kind of plays into another thing I really wanted to kind of talk about, which I do in my novel when we go into the aftermath of the storm and the Omaha Daily Bee and how they kind of struggled to keep subscriptions growing to read about the blizzard, and when you know maybe the East Coast had already moved on, is that I think when things happen in the Midwest or the Great Plains, even today, it never gets the press that if the same thing happens in New York or maybe LA, right, or Boston or Chicago, if it happens in the heartland outside of an urban area, it just doesn't get the publicity. And so I think that kind of, you know, as I was writing this, I was getting a little defensive about our little children's blizzard.
I know, I felt the same exact way. The other thing, I mean, this is tangential, but I think it speaks to what we're, you know, in some ways what we're talking about. I wrote about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. We're coming up on the 150th anniversary of that event. And the act, again, a far more deadly, devastating fire, right, happened the same night. And it was part of the same weather pattern in Wisconsin. It was, you know, and yet people have never even, you know, people don't even talk about that. They have no, you know, it's not even, it's nowhere. It's very, it's really been lost.
Because it didn't happen in Chicago.
Yeah.
But I agree to your point though, that I think this one is more in the DNA of the people whose families are, you know, whose families came over then and who are still in the land. And that DNA runs through, I was just fascinated to think about the fact that the children at the children's blizzard were the grandparents during the Dust Bowl. And so that they experienced just at least two devastating, horrible acts of nature and climate and weather in their lifetime. And I thought, you know, that kind of sticks with me too. I don't know if you thought of that, but
I did. And I think the other thing, and this is why I know we were both so looking forward to coming to the festival in person and really having these conversations with people. One of the people that really sparked my interest in really motivated me to begin to write about the children's blizzard was one of my close friends, Karen, whose parents had homesteaded in North Dakota. Who, you know, her family had come from Denmark. Very similar story to the kind that I'm sure that we both explored in our research. And what she was so struck by, exactly to your point, they had experienced the blizzard. They had experienced the Dust Bowl. They lost everything in the Great Depression, everything. Then the mill burned down. And yet her father, who then later became an engineer and raised the family in Maryland, every year he went back. The part of the family remained on the land, and he passed away during COVID, and he was buried they brought him back to North Dakota to be buried on that land. So there is this, again, just the pull of the,
but I found that to be not an entirely good thing. One of the things I wanted to say with the book was how that the parents' decisions in those days, and this is my family DNA too. My mother's side of the family came over from Germany right around this time period, like in the late 1870s, but they settled in Illinois, not the Great Plains. So it was a little more Midwestern. But I remember family reunions where we would go visit all the great aunts and uncles who still lived on the family farm, and they were all still together. And yes, there's something noble and very American, we like to think, in that, but I also found it tragic in the fact that the decisions of the parents to leave their homeland and come over and really, yoke their fortunes to the land, tied generations and generations and generations of their children to the land. And those children didn't have a say in it, right? And especially in those earlier years, it was very, very hard to break out of that pattern, especially, I think, if you were a boy. Right. I mean, you had to keep the family farm going. And so that left you little opportunity to do anything else. And I do have a character in my novel that is his part of his journey, is that question of, do I have an opportunity to leave, but my family needs me to stay? And and that's a wrenching decision that no parent should thrust upon their children, but these parents did. It kind of goes back to the whole, like, we want to mythologize this time period in American history. So tell me a little bit about that. We were talking about that earlier. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the, as in both my life writing I Survived, where I've written about everything from the Battle of Gettysburg to Pearl Harbor to from Pompeii, Titanic, the Hindenburg. I just finished writing about the Galveston hurricane of 1900, which is a really interesting comparison with the Children's Blizzard, because it was a similar shocking weather event that happened just 12 years after the Children's Blizzard and destroyed the city of Galveston and changed the history of Texas. But in my role at I've worked at Scholastic for 30 years now. Our company is 101 years old. And for, since 1920, we have been, the mission of Scholastic has really been, one of our founding mission is to help kids understand themselves and the world. So as we're today, we're really re-examining how we're telling the stories of our history, through what lens we're telling the story. I know this is such an important mission of the festival, right? Is to have this wide swath, to have as many voices as possible to be telling the stories of our history. And there is something uncomfortable about unraveling some of these beautiful, like we both, Melanie and I both shared our obsession with Little House on the Prairie, and then kind of the anger that personally I felt when I really delved into the true story of what really happened to the Ingalls family. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with piercing that a little bit. It doesn't diminish in many ways, what Laura went through. But in my role at magazines, we are going through this very interesting process of taking these iconic events, whether it's the mystery that we've been telling kids for, forever, the mystery of Roanoke, which has really only been just about the people who arrived with no discussion of who was there. Pretty much, the Revolutionary War, talking about the fact that, what the role of Black people played in that war and Native peoples as well. So I think it's very exciting and super interesting. And I think that kids are very willing and excited to be exploring these events in new ways. And I don't think it has to, again, be divisive in any way. I think it can actually be more uniting for the country to include as many people as possible in this historical tapestry that we're weaving.
This is where our audiences are different. And
they are, Melanie, yes.
When I start to say that one of the reasons I wanted to write this novel was because I wanted to tell the realistic, actual version of Little House on the Prairie, to include the fact that it wasn't just white America settling the plains. and the fact that we have to address the fact those novels are very problematic today. They're written at a different time, for sure, but it is not the truth of the prairie. It basically ignores the fact of those whose land it was in the first place. It ignores the fact that there were people of color there, and it really even kind of ignores the fact that it was immigrants, so many immigrants doing it. It's really telling it's only one, it's Charles and Caroline Ingalls, born in America, and they settled the plains, and that's not correct. And but when I start to explain that, sometimes certain members of my audience are not happy with me to poke. I mean, look, the Little House on the Prairie books are beloved. I mean, I have the best memories of reading them as a child, but as an adult in the 21st century, I think we all have to understand that it was just part of the whole history being told with through one point of view only, and ignoring all the other point of views. So I do sometimes get a little pushback.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly, and I think that, but again, I think that is the interesting thing of, our different audiences. And I think, look, it is uncomfortable. It's very hard for us to let go of things. In fact, I just wanted to go back to a point you made. I just want to rewind our conversation for a second, because another theme, and I think this is a theme in your books as well, and certainly to your point about how people were, once their parents entrenched themselves on these farms, the family, the idea of leaving became so difficult generationally. I think as human beings, it is so difficult for us to elect to make changes. We just, it's so hard. I mean, I think about these people, even now, anyone who's deciding to leave the village, the city, the country where they have everything to strike out into the unknown. There has to be an enormous push to compel you, or something so powerful luring you. And often it's, it's both. And I think that I draw some connection between that, the physical difficulty we have moving, to the difficulty we have letting go of ideas and these myths. I think some people just they feel as though it's destructive, but it's not destructive. We're evolving and including more people. It's creative, and if anything,
I think they think it's destructive. I think they also think it's erasing something about them.
Right.
Whether you're not going to take away my Little House on the Prairie. Well, I don't want to take away your Little House on the Prairie, but I do want you to read it again now as an adult living in this time, and read some of the other things about Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Prairie, and maybe my book and your book, and then understand that we are just evolving as a culture and as a society, and it's taken too long for us to include other voices and other stories, but we have to do that now to continue to evolve. But it's not taking away your memories. Yeah. It's not taking away your childhood. We should all be continuing to grow and evolve, I would hope.
I do too.
But it's hard. It's uncomfortable. Yeah.
It is. Well, it's 8:10. I know that this was the time we had talked about if anyone had any questions, but if not, if any audience member has any questions, we'd love to hear them. But I also have another question for you if no one else wants to chime in.
Yeah, and I had one more thing I wanted to talk about, Crazy Pa Ingalls, but
we love, that we could really talk about that for hours. I wanted to ask you what the most, in your research journey, was there a moment or a discovery you made that was especially exciting or shocking or to you?
I mean, for sure, I had the idea to write it. Just, I read a lot of history anyway, and I know I've been wanting to write kind of a Western novel, and Random House wasn't having any of that. But when I came across this story, they were like, okay, it's kind of like, finally we'll let you write your Western, because they really liked the story. And but I only knew the barest part of it. So when I went to research a little bit more fully before we all signed off on it, that I mentioned it earlier, but the fact that these, not just immigrants, but also people on the East Coast, poor people in tenements in New York City, like your novel, I think your book has, the young boy comes from the East Coast, right? It was a false promise. There was this massive disinformation campaign because the railroad boosters and the governments in these territories the railroad boosters needed people to settle this area so that their railroads could turn a profit, because you need goods and you need people to keep going on your railroads, or else you're not going to make money. And then the territory boosters needed representation in Congress, right, in Washington. So they needed these territories to become states. And through the Homestead Act, which eliminated, it denied anyone who had taken up arms against the United States, which would be all of the Confederacy, they couldn't participate in the Homestead Act. So they needed bodies desperately. And in order to get them, they targeted one part of Europe, which was Northern Europe. And then they hired people to write, I hate to use the word fake news, because I think I don't want to use that word, but they did hire people to write fiction, and they packaged it as fact, in the way they described the land as just a veritable Garden of Eden, where there was, beautiful, bountiful springs and summers with just enough rain, and anything would grow, and the winters were so mild. And of course, it wasn't that.
Those are some of the greatest artifacts, those pamphlets, the translations are some of the most riveting pieces of the primary sources. I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, no, I loved, that. And I'm reading all the old issues of the Omaha Daily Bee in the aftermath of the storm. That's great fun too. But yeah, to me, that was it. That was the moment where I went, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. They didn't teach me that in history. We just learned that immigrants came to this country because they wanted a better place for themselves, more opportunity. Yes, that may have been true in part, but would they have come had they known the truth? And to me, that just made the book. To me, it's just like, oh, I have to write this story. What about you?
Well, I have a couple things, but there's a rabbit hole to take you down, which I went down when I was starting to research this. There's a whole, many people who came, obviously, and most, I agree with, certainly I felt the same way, that it was Northern Europeans coming here, many of them lured by these fantasy, basically, fantasy novels being written about the Garden of Eden. But there's a really interesting body of memoirs about Jewish people from Russia who were absolutely subjugated, under the czars, who had no rights at all, and who came to the East Coast of America, to these cities, these tenements, and still found themselves pretty subjugated, right, by landlords. And and so to them, this idea that you could come and own a piece of land, so I actually have, I put them somewhere. I have these kind of incredible memoirs of this other group of people who were coming, and how they also discovered, in many cases, an opportunity to live in an area where they were not discriminated against. People had to in order to survive. If you had your neighbors, you had to be able to depend on your neighbors. So I think that what I'm always captivated by in all of my research are the many individual tiles, each individual story that makes up a topic. And that, and to me, some of the most interesting stories are the ones that really didn't fit my narrative so much.
Well, that's the thing. I think when you write historical fiction, whether it's for middle grade readers or adults, that it's not that I'm rearranging history more, it's that I have to leave things out. Right. I would really have loved, that's an interesting thing. I would have loved to have gone into more detail about the Black homesteading communities, which I mentioned briefly in the book, but I really don't go there. But you do have to kind of concentrate on one narrative there, and be careful of how many characters you introduce and whose stories you tell.
That's true. One plug I want to put in for anyone in South Dakota is to go to the town of Wessington Springs, which was, to me, the absolute, I will remember that trip for the rest of my life. It was part of the research trip that I took across South Dakota with my husband. And he was very helpful in these research trips. And he had found that Wessington Spring is a small town smack in the middle of the state, very small place. And he said, we should stop they have a cultural center there. So we stopped. Little did we know, everyone should go visit this place. It is in a converted bank building, and volunteers maintain this treasure trove of artifacts from the history of South Dakota, not only of homesteaders but also, artifacts from, from the different native peoples who lived on the land. And it's all in this, it's just all in this, kind of in cases, and there are thousands of artifacts. And for me, that was, of just my specific research of this book, it was going there. And that's where I met a woman named Lorraine, who shared one of the stories that had been handed down to her that ended up in my book. And, which was that one of her distant relatives had gotten lost in the blizzard, had almost died, managed somehow serendipitously stumbled into a barn where there was the hugest pig in the, terrified pig. And the man and the pig huddled together and survived the night. And she said, and after that, no one could say a mean word about a pig in his presence. And just the idea of this story being handed down. And so, those, for me, when I find those little gems, those little stories, even though I'm writing fiction, I'm creating fictional characters, those types of stories always make their way into my books. I'm sure you have the same sort of experience.
And I did base a couple of characters in this on some of the actual oral histories and some of the people who were mentioned in the collection of the oral histories called In All Its Fury. The book about the people remembered the blizzard. So yeah, I definitely do. And I guess we do kind of have to open up to questions now.
Yes.
Merlinda wants to take that over.
Yep, I'm here. So yeah, so we're at about 7:20, but I really want to allow as much time as possible because I know we got a little bit of a late start because of the room mix up. But so we're gonna push this to the limit here. We have a few comments, and Jace has mentioned that she read all of the Little House on the Prairie series and was fortunate to have Native parents to discuss some of the issues that came up regarding these pieces. And she said they use these as teaching tools. And she really appreciates the children's Blizzard books and that she could relate. And that's from Jace, a Lakota elder. So I thought that was an interesting and well-deserved comment to pass on to you. So
thank you.
Yeah. And Carol says, Melanie Benjamin, I love your book, The Autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb.
Thank you. Probably my favorite personally. So
okay. And then Carol says, how do you choose which tile to write about? There are so many to pick from.
Were you talking about all the tiles that you were just talking about?
Right, that you were talking about tiles that make up the whole picture, and how do you choose which story to write about?
I definitely find that to be the most difficult part of writing my books, Carol. And I always, when I'm creating my character, again, I'm writing for a very different audience than Melanie. I'm looking to create a character who feels real, feels authentic to the time, who represents an experience that is somewhat, that is resonant, that also a character who also can connect to who has relationships in his or her life that can connect to get some other voices in there. And I'm mostly really trying to make these topics relevant and accessible to kids from all over the country. So it's been, I've heard from so many of my readers saying, I want to go to South Dakota and visit. This sounds, and to inspire kids to want to experience, to travel to other parts of America, to connect with kids from different parts of the country. I very much feel that these stories can be very uniting. And even though as we're telling them in new ways and trying to break apart and break apart some of the parts that are not true, and to incorporate some of the truths that are not as easy to stomach. So it's a difficult, if anyone has any advice on how I can make it easier to choose the tile, I don't know, perhaps Melanie does.
It's about, so like, I have an intention with every book that I write. And, I've talked about the intention of this was to write that kind of more realistic Little House on the Prairie book. And then as I'm doing the research, certain themes kind of leap out at me and they have to be things that I think, and it's guesswork, but I'm guessing that people today can relate to. even though they happened in 1888. So those are always kind of the things I'm really trying to pull out of the story. So as those kind of themes emerge, and again, sometimes I have to winnow them out. I can't touch on all of them, but I have to kind of create a chain of them, and then create characters who can kind of represent those different themes, but yet they all have to be able to be, relatable to each other. They kind of, maybe they're far apart at the beginning of the book, but they all kind of have to come back together, all these different characters. So that's how I have to do it, and I've learned, there were some people who read the Children's Blizzard, and, there are a couple of, comments by readers that they thought there were too many characters. I have to acknowledge that readers today versus maybe if you read Great Expectations by Dickens in the 1870s, we kind of, I don't want to say simplify, but we don't appreciate quite as many characters when we're reading today. I mean, those are kind of marketing things you kind of have to be mindful of. And so I did kind of I got rid of one character's point of view. It was the character of Gunnar Peterson. I actually had him have his own point of view in a chapter or two. And my editor said, one, we don't need it, because we hate him anyway. And it's more interesting if we just see him through the women's eyes and just get rid of him. So that was an instance where I maybe had one tile too many, and I had to get rid of that tile. He's still in there, but just he doesn't get his own chapter. So yeah, it's just it's trial and error. It's gut feeling. It's your experience as a novelist, knowing what I need to do to keep a compelling story going, so people will want to keep reading. So I'm not overloading it with too much, right? And that I'm keeping it kind of pure and simple, but yet discussable.
I think that we want, when we're writing about history, I see my series very much as door openers for kids. And I'm hoping that, I always say to every kid that I meet, and I actually say this, to myself, whenever I'm reading a book about history, I think, okay, what do I want to read next? This is one, this now. I always tell kids, the more things you're interested in, the more interesting life is, because then you always want to know more. So reading, Melanie's book, which, has her characters, or one of my books that has my characters, that's, creating, it's a vignette, really, one vignette in a vast historical sweep. Hopefully you want, okay, now what else is out there? There's so many incredible books about, this topic that we're just, dipping our toes into through our books. So that's always my hope, to kind of propel my readers into a whole world of history.
And I always have to remember, my greatest responsibility to my reader is just to tell a really interesting story. I'm a storyteller. It's all about the story. Right. And so that also helps me not overload the novel with too much other stuff. And at its heart, people just have to care deeply about these characters and want to see what happens to them next.
Right. There's some great comments. I want to say hi to Heidi, and your incredible comment there. I agree with you. It is the question to stay or to leave, and the intense pull that place. I live in the town where I was born, where I grew up. And I just can't, I do very much relate to, my parents are here, my brother's here, the bossiest girl in my 6th grade class is now my doctor. There's a great feeling of security, and I don't know, this deep rootedness. I feel incredibly fortunate, not that it's the perfect place to live. And there's certainly parts of it that, that make me want to leave sometimes. So thanks for sharing.
And I think I would have been one of the ones on the boat leaving.
I know. I am definitely
born explorers. And like, my dad has never lived more than 20 miles away from where he was born, but myself, both of my children, we are all continuing to moving and discovering new places.
Yeah,
we just kind of have itchy feet. We're always wanting, we like where we are, but might be something better. Yeah. I got a little bit of Paul Ingalls in me, I guess.
No, don't say it, Melanie. No.
I'm not dragging anyone against their will.
Melanie and I both feel that Paul Ingalls I would never have wanted my daughter to date him, because he was a little crazy. So Cindy had a really good question, and I know we're running out of time, but when writing historical fiction, how do you find the voice of people who lived in the time with or without today's filter? And I think that's an incredible question. And I think that's really where the depth and breadth of research really help. Melanie keeps talking about reading the Omaha Bee. I do that too. There's what we're so fortunate about is there are so many ways to immerse yourself in the voices, the words, the tone, the mood, the smells, the tastes of the time period. And then to be, kind of almost for me, I'm constantly combing through my book over and over to make sure that my voice is a voice that would be, that sounds true to the time. And it's very, for me, like fine brushstroke. I don't know about you, Melanie.
It's balancing act. I have to say the first historical novel I wrote was set during the Victorian age in Britain, Alice I Have Been in 2010. And when I started writing, and it was my first historical novel, I didn't have a publisher. I didn't know if it would be published. I sent a little bit to my agent at the time. And she loved the idea of the novel about the real Alice in Wonderland. But she said, you sound too contemporary. So then, and she gave me, because I didn't know what I was doing. I was learning as I went. And she gave me a couple of Victorian era novels written in the time, like by Wilkie Collins and a couple of others to read. So then I went back after doing so, and then I kind of rewrote it again, and I sent it to her, and she said, now you sound way too Victorian. Modern audiences are going to have trouble reading this. Yeah. You got to find something in the middle. And then I went back and did it again, and I found it. So yeah. It was trial and error for me back then. 10 years later, I think I get it now. But part of it is immersing yourself in this world, reading the things written in this time, I think is very, very important. But then also understanding that you are writing for people born in 1980, right? So you have to give it's like you give a little taste of it, right? A little hint of it, but it's not the full, it's not like you're speaking in a different language. You can't go fully there. Right. Yeah.
What do you think, Melinda?
Well, I think we're doing great. Just to add to Cindy's question, Carol had written in, and I think it just came to me, but she kind of wanted to piggyback on that about dialoguing in today's language or versus touching on the language of yesteryear.
And so I think we answered that.
Yeah, right. So she wants you to know that she has your books on her reading list.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, well, we've run this right up to the time limit, and I'm so happy that we've been able to do that. If anybody has any last questions to quickly type in, we'll just take, we'll take one more maybe.
Thanks to everyone who showed up on a Saturday evening. This is great.
I know. It was so great to be with you all.
And thank you, Festival of Books and South Dakota Humanities for putting this together. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, yes, on behalf of all of us here at the Humanities Council, we're certainly happy to have you here. We thank you, Melanie and Lauren, for sharing your expertise and sharing all of this nice, wonderful information about your books. We thank all the people out on Zoom and Facebook that we were all able to get together now in this same Zoom meeting. So I hope that, I think there's just one more presentation this evening now at 7:30, but we hope that you are able to visit our website, sdbookfestival.com/virtual, and look for some more great programming that we have even tomorrow and coming up in the next week. So Melanie and Lauren, do you have any final remarks before we all leave each other?
I also just want to thank all of you and the incredible work that you have all done to create this festival. I have my calendar. I'm going to be definitely tuning into some of the program that you have set. It sounds incredible. And thank you to everyone who joined. And thank you all for, I just felt so welcomed when I traveled through South Dakota. It was a magical experience to meet so many people and to be able to have people so generously sharing their stories. And so I feel determined to get back there, if not for this festival, sometime soon. I'm sure, Melanie, you feel the same.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. And like one day I will be there, South Dakota. I was supposed to be there last year. It didn't happen. I was supposed to be there this year. It didn't happen. One day I will make it.
Right.
And I can't wait to meet you all in person. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Good night. Have a great weekend.
Yep. Thanks for sharing this time with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.